Can you imagine having to choose between freedom and the man you love? This is the story of Yoon-seo. Listen carefully and discover the strength of a young woman as she strives to lift her family out of poverty. The power of women is highlighted in this story. The cold was the only constant in our village near Hae-won, a cold that seeped into the marrow of the bone and stayed there, an invisible occupant in the cramped hut we called home. We suffered deep systemic scarcity. There was no electricity after 7 p.m. The darkness wasn't just physical, it was the sound of the world closing in on us, forcing us to rely on dim, illegal oil lamps or stolen batteries. The hunger was worse than the cold. My mother, Hae-won, always smelled faintly of burnt wood and desperation, a scent that was the fabric of our lives. My father, Jong-hoon, a man whose spine was straighter than any loyalty oath he was forced to utter, would whisper revolutionary poetry to me when the surveillance patrols had passed, poems about stars that had long since died but whose light still traveled the universe. That light was our perspective, the only future we were permitted to imagine, a ghost of hope in a land of enforced darkness. We were members of the songbun, the lowest tier, the hostile class, meaning that every meager ration of rice was an insult, every political meeting a ritual humiliation, and every official stamp for a travel permit or school application was denied. This restrictive classification dictated everything: our level of permissible hunger, our education, our overall worth to the state. My parents had been caught once, years ago, trying to sell illegally harvested medicinal herbs to feed me. They spent 6 months in a labor camp, 6 months that stripped my mother of her softness and replaced it with a granite resolve. The system didn't just starve the body, it methodically murdered the soul, brick by heavy, sensorial brick. We lived on the periphery of life, watching the high-ranking officials drive through the muddy streets in their impeccable black Mercedes, a shocking display of wealth and total impunity. Their wives, bundled in thick, clean fur, carried purses filled with imported goods, their children holding white rice rolls while mine scraped dried kernels from the bottom of our pot. The class contrast was sickening. Their excess was our famine, directly linked to the resources stolen from the struggling populace. Their privilege was a physical weight, a constant sneering reminder of our worthlessness, built on the suffering of people like us. I remember one New Year's Day, watching an official's son toss a half-eaten candied sweet onto the snow. It felt like a deliberate act of contempt, a political statement written in sugar and waste. My own misery was a dull, constant ache, but my father's was a towering, silent rage, a pressure cooker with a failing valve. He knew, and Mother knew, that I, Yoon-seo, had no chance here. No marriage, no education, no job that wasn't back-breaking manual labor, and certainly no chance to love freely. The plan had been simmering in the secret language of their hands across the dinner table for months. It crystallized after the Great Drought. The official rations disappeared entirely, the hunger turning aggressive, causing dizzying pain that made days an endless blur of weakness. Jong-hoon was thin, his cheekbones sharp enough to cut paper, but his mind remained lucid. The risk of defection was incalculable, an act of sheer, terrifying desperation. If caught, the penalty was certain execution for him, and a sentence of perpetual political imprisonment for us, a slow death for 3 generations in a brutal camp. He knew we could not all go at once. 3 people crossing the Tumen River was an anomaly. 2, a mother and daughter, a desperate but common act of survival. The decision was final, delivered one night under the cover of a whistling stovepipe. Hae-won and I would go first. We were less suspicious, smaller shadows. He would stay, work for a few more months to establish an alibi, and then follow, taking the longer, safer route through the mountains when the snows had fully melted. It was a lie, a beautiful, necessary lie they both knew was more likely a farewell than a promise. But it allowed them to breathe, to act. The preparation was meticulous, terrifyingly simple. 2 layers of worn clothing, 3 small packets of dry corn powder hidden in the stitching of my mother's skirt hem, and a single, faded photograph of my father's grandmother, a talisman of a world before the Cold War. The day before we left, my father took me to the riverbank under the guise of chopping wood. The river, which separated our miserable existence from the dangerous promise of China, was already beginning to freeze over, a ribbon of jagged gray ice. The border surveillance here was constant. The guards incentivized to shoot on sight, and the punishment for aiding a defector was summary death for the entire family unit. He pressed my hand, hard, and whispered the only prayer we knew. "Be water, Yoon-seo. Water finds the way." That night, I cried into the shoulder of my father, tasting the salt of my tears mixed with the grime on his worn jacket. There was no romance now, only the cold, brutal geometry of survival. The last thing he said, his face shadowed by the small lantern, was, "Do not look back. If you look back, you will see a life that is already dead." We left at 3 a.m. The moon was a sliver of brittle ice in the sky. The hut was dark, the door creaking shut behind us like a dying animal's sigh. My mother moved with the silent, predatory grace of a starving cat. The path to the river was short, treacherous, and patrolled. Every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind, sounded like the shout of a guard. When we reached the bank, the river was an abstract painting of black water and gray ice flows, moving too fast to be predictable. My mother tested the ice with a long, thin stick. It cracked. She chose a different path. We held hands, my mother's grip a painful vice, pulling me forward. The cold was instantly immobilizing, penetrating the worn fabric of my shoes. We waded into the black water, shards of ice tearing at our ankles, the shock stealing my breath. It was shallow but deceptively powerful, dragging us sideways. My mother, heavier and stronger, took the brunt of the current, shielding me with her body. Then came the ice. We had to crawl across slick, treacherous flows, the edges of the ice sharp as knives. At one point, a sheet of ice broke beneath my mother's foot. She didn't scream, just gasped, clinging to the edge with fingers that were rapidly turning blue. Her eyes wide with a fear so primal it made my own heart stop. I pulled with all my desperate strength, and she lunged, collapsing onto the frozen mud of the Chinese bank. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, coughing, weeping silent, shivering tears, the water freezing to our clothes, the sound of our North Korean homeland receding into a terrifying silence. We were free of the land, but not of the system. The freedom lasted exactly 3 days. We were found huddled in an abandoned shack in Yeonji by a group of men. They were not police, but they had the same authority, the same cold, calculating eyes. They were smugglers and brokers, and they knew exactly who we were. Illegal goods, disposable, and worth a significant bribe to stay quiet. The price for our temporary freedom was servitude, immediate and total. The threats were explicit. Deportation back across the Tumen, back to the labor camp, or worse, if we didn't comply. My mother became instantly protective, a hawk guarding her nest, negotiating terms with a chilling clarity that belied her terrified eyes. The blackmail was constant and psychological. The brokers didn't just threaten us. They made us sign a document in a language we barely understood. A false confession stating we were illegal economic migrants who voluntarily chose to work for them to repay a debt. This paper, they sneered, was their insurance. A single phone call, and we would be on a truck back to Heesan. We were sent to a massive illegal textile factory deep in the mountains. The work was endless. 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, feeding endless spools of thread into roaring, complex machines in a room thick with lint and the acrid smell of hot oil. We were paid nothing. Our wage was the ladle of watery rice porridge we received twice a day, barely enough to keep us vertical at the machines. We slept on wooden pallets jammed into a filthy dormitory, the cold metal frame of the textile machine our only real companion during the day. My fingers bled. My back was a constant screaming agony. And my exhaustion was so profound I often hallucinated the smell of my father's pipe tobacco. The humiliation was the control they wielded, the constant verbal abuse, the knowledge that we were utterly invisible to the law, and the requirement to submit to every petty demand of the foreman to keep our deportation papers from being filed. We didn't understand the complex Chinese legal system or even the factory's safety rules, making us vulnerable to accidents and immediate docking of the meager food rations for mistakes. This was a new kind of hell, one paved with stolen Chinese money and fueled by North Korean terror. It was here, amidst the ceaseless metallic clamor, that I met Wei. He was older, perhaps 30, a Chinese-Korean foreman whose task was to enforce the impossible quotas. He was harsh, but his eyes held a weariness that matched ours. He saw my mother's fierce dedication and my own bone-deep fatigue. He started with small kindnesses, an extra cup of rice mixed with bean paste, a moment's rest hidden behind a tower of raw cotton, a blanket on the freezing concrete floor. These were not acts of altruism. They were acts of mutual human recognition in a place that strove to dehumanize us all. Over weeks, the shared exhaustion and the unspoken truth of our parallel suffering created an intense bond. I was 19, desperate for protection, for warmth, for any sign that my body was more than a tool of production. He was a lonely man, trapped in a moral gray zone. One night, after a particularly grueling shift that left me shaking and tearful, he led me to his small, guarded room, a luxury we could never access. The air was warm, and he had a small, flickering lamp. He simply heated a basin of water and gently washed the black grease from my hands, his touch surprisingly tender, reverent. It was in that moment of profound vulnerability, the quiet acknowledgement of my existence as a person, not a machine, that I felt a dizzying wave of need. We found a fierce, fleeting solace in each other's arms, a silent, intensely private language of bodies, seeking refuge from the overwhelming cold of the world. It was a desperate, protective intimacy, fueled by the shared knowledge of the abyss waiting outside the door. His breath against my ear, his strong arms around me, became the temporary wall that kept the North Korean regime from reclaiming my sanity. The eroticism was the intense relief, the sense of being held and safe for a moment, a fierce, whispered denial of the dehumanization we faced every day. He never promised me forever, only today, and that was enough. He was my temporary anchor, the one person who saw my fear and covered it with his warmth. This intense, fragile intimacy lasted 3 months. He knew I had to go south, and he knew he could not follow. When the time came, and my mother had saved enough money from her relentless overtime, Wei secured us passage south, not as a lover's gift, but as a practical act of farewell, a final offering of safety. The journey to South Korea was the second nightmare. It was a chaotic scramble across 3 countries, facilitated by a network of brokers and underground churches. We traveled mostly by night, packed into the backs of stifling trucks with other silent, terrified faces, hidden in fishing boats that pitched dangerously on rough seas, and walked for days through humid, unfamiliar jungles in Southeast Asia. We saw things that cannot be spoken, felt the shadow of betrayal and capture loom over every meal, every rest stop. My mother's granite resolve only hardened. She became our navigator, our protector, arguing with angry drivers, haggling for water, always keeping the small, heavy coin purse tied around her waist safe. I held onto the ghost of Wei's touch, the memory of that safe, quiet room, using it as a shield against the crushing exhaustion. There were days of famine that rivaled North Korea's, days when the only food was scavenged fruit, days when we had to bribe border guards with the little money we had left, almost derailing the entire plan. But every step was a step further from the cold river, a step closer to the shimmering, impossible promise of Seoul. We spoke less and less, our communication reduced to glances and the painful, reassuring squeeze of a hand. The goal was so close, yet seemed to stretch into an infinite horizon of danger. When we finally, miraculously, arrived at the South Korean embassy in a neighboring country, the processing felt surreal. We were ushered into a clean, air-conditioned room, offered real bread and hot tea, and asked questions about the horrors we had fled. We were flown, finally, to Incheon. We landed in a storm of noise and light, a city that was impossibly vibrant, fast, and overwhelming. The first few days were the most disorienting. Despite being free, we had nothing. We were taken to a temporary processing center, but when released, the vastness of Seoul swallowed us. We slept for 3 nights in an underpass near a major station, terrified of the kindness of strangers and distrustful of the police, our clothes still smelling of the textile factory and the sea. The cold was gone, replaced by the humid heat of a bustling summer, but the cold of the soul remained. The government resettlement program eventually took us in, providing us with a small stipend and mandatory orientation classes on how to live in the modern world, how to use an ATM, how to cross a street with traffic lights, how to speak the slightly different, softer dialect of the South. My mother immediately found work, not the back-breaking labor of China, but a relentless string of cleaning jobs, office buildings by day, restaurants by night. She worked with the quiet fury of a woman who had seen the bottom of the world and refused to go back. I took on part-time work in a convenience store, studying at night. Every single one was scrutinized, saved, and added to the rapidly growing pile. The shame of being a defector, the constant feeling of being an outsider, never left us, but it was fuel. I enrolled in night school, then managed to get into a community college, studying commerce and logistics. I excelled. The hunger that had once been in my stomach was now a hunger for achievement, a relentless drive to prove that my father's sacrifice was not in vain. Years passed. The sacrifices paid off. I graduated near the top of my class and secured a good position at a mid-sized trading company. The pay was good, and the apartment we found was our greatest victory, a modest, bright 2-bedroom flat in a safe neighborhood. It had running hot water, a kitchen with a clean refrigerator, and a balcony where my mother could grow small, pungent chili plants. A small piece of the North, domesticated and safe. We sat on that balcony on my first payday, drinking cheap, sweet coffee, and for the first time since that terrible night, my mother truly smiled. It wasn't the fierce grimace of resolve, but a soft, tired, genuinely happy curve of her lips. Our happy ending was not a fairy tale. It was a realistic, hard-won victory, built on calloused hands and an unbreakable emotional bond. But the story is not truly finished. My father, Jong-hoon. There has been no word. The channels of communication are impossible, choked by the North's suffocating surveillance. We tried for years, sending messages through old brokers, risking our savings. But the silence remained absolute. Is he in a camp? Is he dead? Did he simply choose not to follow, sacrificing his life to ensure our freedom? We will never know. Every birthday, every holiday, we set out a small extra bowl of rice, a ritual of remembrance and hope. I am a professional now, wearing a suit, driving a small car, successful by every metric of the South. But I still jump when a door slams unexpectedly. The trauma is etched deep. Yet we are free. We have light and warmth and safety. The perspective of the future is wide and bright. We have conquered the system that tried to crush us. We succeeded because of my father's sacrifice and because of the promise whispered on the banks of a frozen river to keep moving forward. We cling to the belief that one day a miracle will happen and a call will come, proving that water, indeed, found the way for him too. Until then, we live our best lives for him, a testament to the price of freedom. If you love this story and want to hear more like it, please hit that subscribe button. It truly means the world to us and helps us grow. And hey, while you're at it, let's aim for 50 likes on this video. Help us smash that goal.